Hey guys, it's Confetti here. Welcome to the Deck Tech. I'm assuming you've come here from the gameplay link, but if not, have a look either at the description down below or at the end of the video where I will have a link to the gameplay for you. This deck is a landmark mid-range deck. It is built around using Talia to get more value from all of the landmarks, as well as being able to level her up and then use the Absolver as a combo with it to spike an enormous burst of damage out of nowhere. However, there is a lot more depth to the deck than just leveling Talia, chugging Overwhelm on her, and winning the game. So, I'll break this down into each individual package that we have in the deck. We'll go over them one by one, and I'll point out all of the little interactions and combos that you can play this deck as well as you can. So, first, we're going to start off with our landmarks. These are the centerpiece of the deck. This is what the deck revolves around, and it's what makes everything else actually worth playing, and it's probably why you've clicked on this video in the first place. So, we'll start off with 3 Ancient Preparations. You could absolutely play 2 of these, but if you do, I would recommend picking up probably an extra Preservarium. The reason we use this is that it gives us a blocker on turn 3, assuming you manage to drop it on turn 1, and it smooths out our draws a little bit. This deck doesn't have a lot of card draw, but having the card selection makes it feel like we have more cards than we do, just because the power level on average increases, and we can find the answers we need in a given matchup. Following on from that, we have Akshan. Akshan himself is not a landmark, but he does create the Warlord's Palace, which is why we're running 3 of them, because it's a 2 mana, we get a good body out of him, and we get what is quite a valuable landmark, even if it does take a while to get the full value out of. Usually, with the Warlord's Palace, we will just be predicting then drawing 1. However, a really nice combo with this is if you can manage to get the Warlord's Palace down to a countdown of 1 or 2, which is very easy in this deck, and then copy it with your Talia, you have a lot of card draw that comes out of nowhere. If you think you can threaten lethal, you can either throw out 2 Sandstorm charges at once, or you can give everything 2 attack, or a combination of all 3 of these options. The Warlord's Horde we won't hit as often, but when we do, it can be very strong, especially with Shield of the Sentinels. Being able to give Malphite and Talia, especially once she's been buffed up with the Absolver, Spell Shield as well as a bit of extra stats. It feels so good, and it will very often end games if you have 2 champions on the board when you use this. Following on from Akshan, we have a 1-of Ancient Hourglass, because not a landmark, but it does generate one. One of the really nice combos with this is utilising it with Talia. So you can cast it on your Talia, play a second Talia from hand, and end up with 2 Talias on the board. Alternatively, you can do it on anything that's big and scary, such as a Malphite or an activated Earth Elemental, and use your Talia to copy that, if that's what you need in that given situation. Other than that, it's good protection, and you can also use it to speed up your Warlord's Palace by either casting it on Akshan or casting it on the Vagabond, both of which will use their play effects and advance the Warlord's Palace by 1 or 2 turns respectively. We also have 2 copies of Preservarium because we do need a little bit of card draw. This helps us stop running dry. This isn't very often a good play on turn 2. You would much rather see something a little bit more proactive, but that gas is very important for this deck. We do have Rockhopper, who is primarily here as a unit, but he does play a landmark. We will cover him in more depth in the unit section. Similarly, Vagabonds can create the landmark, the Warlord's Palace, which we've touched on with Akshan. But this is primarily here as a 3-drop. All in all, these landmarks, none of them individually win you the game. They are not your win cons, but they enable other parts of the deck, and they help provide you a bit of value, and they help smooth your draws out. Don't think of these as the big heavy hitters, think of this more as the glue that holds the deck together. When you are mulliganing with this deck, you want to try and make sure that you have at least 1 landmark activator in your opening hand. This is just to enable things such as chip and chip stone, which you really want to get going straight away. Moving on, we will look at the creature package. So we'll start off with everyone's favourite rock, everyone's best boy, Chip. Chip in this deck is a 1 mana 3/3, which is the best value you can get for a 1-drop in this game. And it's not even like you have to work hard to activate a plunder effect or anything like that. Just by playing this deck, you will activate Chip, and being able to drop multiple chips early in the game can lead to a lot of pressure early on, which makes it very easy to set up for an Overwhelm combo to finish the game later on. We are also running 2 Treasure Seekers. Main reason for this is that It gives us 2 bodies, and with the amount of vulnerable we can give in this deck, it means that the Waking Sounds can very often get favourable trades in for us. Or if not, we can just use it as an extra burst of damage because we can be very explosive at times with this deck. Akshan, I have already covered. However, one thing that I do want to point out, which I'm sure you're probably aware of by this point, is the synergy between the quick attack and the vulnerable combo. He does also double up as another target for the Absolver, but we'll cover that more later. We have the Rockhopper. He's a good body, he gives things vulnerable, he makes us a landmark. I would never cut this card. He is never amazing, but is always solid, and I'm usually quite happy to see it in the opening hand. Merciless Hunter is here mostly just as a very solid 3-drop that can help us control the board in the early game, especially against more aggressive decks, which we can struggle against a little bit. It's got that fearsome on it, so it can help you push damage in the early game, and you can get some favourable trades out of it. You know it and you either hit it or love it. We're playing it because it's good. The Vagabond is here primarily to help synergize with Akshan. It's a backup landmark enabler. You don't really want to rely on this to be your first landmark, you want something before it, but it is still solid. It helps get you that extra card advantage from the Warlord's Palace, and it gives you a body that you can block with or start putting a bit of pressure on the opponent. Earth Elemental is one of the strongest cards in this deck. It does look a little bit like a bad Ruin Runner on a first glance, because you're swapping Spell Shield for an extra point of toughness, and it costs 1 less, but you do need to work to activate it. We won't usually see this activated on turn 4, but turn 5 and 6, it is very likely you will have this activated. At which point, a 6-5 with Overwhelm feels really good. You could instead play Ruin Runner, you could play it in conjunction too. However, the gap between 4 and 5 mana feels quite big in this deck. Being able to get out that 1 turn earlier matters a lot to be able to stall the aggressive decks and have a blocker with that big, thick, juicy butt on it, and being able to get the aggression in against a control deck a turn earlier feels really good. Next, we're going to look at Stonebreaker. We're skipping over Talia just for now. Stonebreaker only running as a one-off, although you could increase the number of this if you wanted to. However, I think if you go into, there's probably better cards to look at first. The reason we're using this is primarily as a bit of reach. That extra 2 damage to the Nexus can help us finish a game quite often. The 4 damage I often find feels a little bit lacking. Against a lot of decks, you're either going up against Spell Shield, a creature that has more than 4 toughness, or you're wasting it on something that's quite small and only has 1 or 2 toughness. So it never feels amazing, but it can come in clutch to help secure a game. If I was to start cutting cards, this would probably be one of the first ones I would cut. Next, we'll look at Malphite. We are only playing 1 Malphite right now, and there is a reason for that, and that's because of the current meta. In the current meta, it's quite aggressive. We're seeing a lot of fast, low-to-the-ground aggro decks, so having 3 Malphites in your deck means that it can get clogged up in your hands. It feels like you're not going anywhere, and you just get killed before you get to play the game. However, I don't want to have none of them because he's really good to break the mid-range mirror matches. Having 1 Malphite drawing him and getting him leveled means that you can put so much pressure on your opponent. You can stun all of the defenders on your attack turn, and he's a really good target for the Absolver. You could potentially go up to 2 Malphites, however, in the current metagame, I wouldn't recommend it. Finally, we're going to look at Talia. Talia is our main source of value in this deck. Copying things such as a Preservarium means that we can get so much more card draw. That 1 card that we were getting now turns into 4. It just gives you value, essentially. Another really neat little synergy with it is targeting the Warlord's Palace, because it can give you so much value, and even better, the Warlord's Horde. However, we don't very often get to the point where we have the Warlord's Horde that actually gets counted down on. She is also really strong currently once she is leveled. We level her very easily by turn 6, quite often. She will be active and leveled. If you give her the Absolver, the way the combo works essentially is she will attack and throw her 3 rocks which each deal 2 damage. They will kill almost any blocker in this game, and then she will attack in for another 8 damage to the opponent's Nexus. Potentially with more if they only chump blocked with something little. Let's say that they throw in a little 2-2. You're going to be hitting for 12 damage. And that can just give you a huge burst of damage out of nowhere. That can happen very, very quickly. You could very definitely go up to 3 copies of Talia in this deck. However, I have playtested a little bit and I find that she can be a little bit clunky and you don't always want to see multiple copies of her. However, if you cut a copy of Akshan and brought in the 3rd Talia, more power to you. It's perfectly viable. Go for it. Next, we're going to look at the Absolver. The Absolver is one of the key pieces of this deck, hence why we are running 3 copies. It can feel like a copy too much sometimes, because generally you only need 1 copy of this card in a given game. However, you want it in every game, which is why we're running 3. And we have a lot of really good targets for the Absolver. If you don't know what it does, essentially it is a bare speed combat trick that gives you +2/+1 this round. If you have leveled a champion this game, it will give you the Absolver's Return, which will give something Overwhelm and +2/+1 this round. A couple of key things to note with this is that you have to have played the champion to level it. So if you've played 5 landmarks in the game but you haven't played a Talia from your hand, this will not give you the return. And the same with Akshan. If you have managed to complete a Warlord's Palace but you have not played your Akshan since you have done that, you will not get the leveled copy and get the Absolver's Return. Another thing to note is that you do not need to cast both copies on the same card, although very often in this deck we will. The main time when you wouldn't is either to try and keep a creature alive or to play around flash freezes and other such effects. We have a lot of targets for the Absolver in this deck. If we just work down our curve, we start with Akshan. The big strength of putting on Akshan is he has quick attack, so you can use it to favorably trade into a lot of big things. And it will also rapidly advance your Warlord's Palace or Horde, which can help you generate more value down the line. The problem is with Akshan is that he comes with a relatively small body, so he can more easily be killed by an opponent's removal, and he won't push quite as much damage as something a little bit bigger. Another good choice is the Merciless Hunter, and that's just because of the fearsome keywords. Here we don't really utilise the Overwhelm anywhere near as much, but it does mean that we can potentially get something in unblocked and just pump its power by 4 and get in for quite a bit more. Another nice little synergy, both with the Merciless Hunter and the Rock Hopper with the Absolver, is using the vulnerable keywords to be able to make sure that when you attack, you can make sure that whatever blocks your creature you're putting the Absolver on only has 1 or 2 toughness to push as much damage as possible. This can be particularly relevant against decks such as Turbo Thralls or against GP Sejuani, where they're split between really big beefy lads and wee little things. Put vulnerable on something little, stick Overwhelm on whatever your biggest thing is and slap that little thing, and you'll put through a lot of damage on the face. Earth Elemental can be a target, however it can feel a little bit wasted here. You quite often be better just chucking a Shaped Stone on it. It comes with the Overwhelm natively, but it does have quite a high attack stat, and it's got quite a high toughness, so it's going to be tough for your opponent to kill through removal, unless it's like a Vengeance or it's damage and Scorched Earth or something. And being able to get that 10 damage through can be quite a lot, but it's only an okay target. But it is worth bearing in mind that you can choose this as a potential target. Talia is our main target for this because being able to push through potentially 12 damage really hurts our opponents. Realistically, you won't push that full 12, that's probably not going to happen. What's more realistic is you will get 8 or 10. But it is a very quick combo, and this 2 cards synergize really well because Talia levels up very easily in this deck, and with the Absolver relying on that level, they go together hand in hand. So if you have a starting hand with Talia, Absolver, and 2 landmarks, you are probably going to be able to pop off and get this combo on turn 6, maybe 7 if that's when you're attacking. The final target is Malphite. Malphite has the highest attack stat out of any card in this deck, so he becomes a good target because of that. He's really tough to kill. Basically the only thing that will kill him is Vengeance, or if you let him get damage beforehand, is a Scorched Earth. There isn't much else that's going to be able to hurt him really. You do, however, have to watch out for stuns. So slap that Absolver on him, push for a bunch of damage. Then to round out this deck, we do have 3 copies of Shaped Stone. This is always going to be active in this deck. It's a solid combat trick even in decks that can't reliably activate it, so it becomes even better for us. But it's useful to generally push extra damage and trade into something much bigger than your unit, or occasionally keep something alive. On top of it, we have a single copy of Hush, and we just have the single copy of Hush more than anything just as a release valve. Sometimes you desperately need a Hush, and having the one copy there can come in very useful in certain matchups. The one where I find I tend to use it the most is the Zoe Lee matchup, just to be able to buy me that extra turn by getting rid of the overwhelm on the Lee. It can also come in useful if you come up against Nasus, we're seeing a lot less of them, or Viego, where they just want to try and get something big and beefy and atrocity at your Nexus. Being able to hush it and take it down to 2 or 5 power is a lot better than getting hit in the face for 18. Finally, we have our ground slams. This will almost always be active in the deck, so you can think of it kind of like a gotcha without the draw effect, which isn't amazing, but we're in regions that don't have the best removal. Another important thing to note with it is the stun. I have used this a lot to be able to stop lethals from a leveled Vi, Nasus, Viego, anything big and scary that you can't conventionally kill. This can help just knock onto that backline so that they're no longer attacking you. And you can use it to be able to just remove a blocker and push that extra little bit of lethal damage in to finish the game. Now I just want to talk about Talia for a little bit. Talia is one of the most powerful cards in this deck, but only when you can use her at the right times. So because of that, quite often you will want to try and time your landmarks with Talia, because the majority of what we use, and especially the ones that you would want to copy, have a countdown effect. So you would want to play your Preservarium, ideally on turn 4 if you plan on playing Talia turn 5, so that you can get as much value out of it as you can. Similarly, you might want to try and sync up your Warlord's Horde with Talia, and that can mean things like not attacking with your Akshan, so that you can get that extra little bit of value out. However, it's really important to note that you need to be sensible with when you do this and not get too greedy. Certain matchups will not allow for that, and sometimes you just have to play to the board and either try and race your opponent down or just stem the bleeding so that pirates don't burn you out too quickly. Another really neat little thing that we can do with Talia is utilize her threaded volley against a vulnerable target. So this means that it can kill something that you would otherwise be kind of wary of attacking into. So this can do up to 6 damage. If your opponent has something where your Merciless Hunters and your Akshans and anything else really cannot trade into it without dying, if it has 6 toughness, you can use your Talia to hook it and use her essentially as a removal piece. It's almost like a better quick attack. However, you have to be really wary of anything with tough, because it will only deal 1 damage each time, so it can be tough to kill something like a leveled Lysandra with Talia. Okay, so now I want to talk about a few tech choices that you could put into this deck. I'm going to start by talking about a few alternate landmarks you could put in, the strengths of them and why I haven't put them in the deck in the first place. So the first is Salt Spire. This card, countdown 2, give you a Grumpy Rock Bear, and then if you've played 4 or more landmarks, it gives it +2/+2. Well, strongest ally +2/+2. The reason we're not playing this is it can be a bit slow. If the meta was a bit more mid-range and control-y, this card would be amazing, but right now I'm not a fan of it, although in the right matchups this can be the strongest card you will play, but I'm not seeing enough of those matchups to be able to value it over another card. Another problem with it is that you're not getting that creature till turn 6 and you're taking your turn 4 off, and turn 4 is quite important. It's when other decks are dropping things like a Sivir. Taking your turn off against something like that it's a bad place to be, which is why I'm not running any, but I could see you running potentially up to 3 copies in the right meta. Another card that I want to talk about, and I feel like I have to talk about it in conjunction with Unraveled Earth, is Desert Naturalist. This card can give you a huge tempo swing on turn 4 if you have a landmark to target. However, what I have noticed sometimes, in this deck you can end up in a situation where you don't have a landmark, and if you try and engineer a situation where you do have a landmark, you can either end up screwing up your Talia or just sacrificing so much tempo on the board that it's not really worth it. This card could be really good if we were in a meta where your opponents were playing landmarks, so you can guarantee you'll always get some kind of value out of it. However, right now I'm not particularly a fan. However, there is a really neat little combo you can do with Unraveled Earth, which allows you essentially to, on turn 4, if you have 3 spell mana banked, to be able to burst speed, Unravel Death, draw cards, 2 Roiland Sands, throughout that Desert Naturalist, and you've got a huge tempo swing right there. It is a strong combo, however, the Unravel Death can feel bad if you don't have a Desert Naturalist in hand as well, which means that it can be quite weak and it can be a bit clunky at times. Again, this is something that I could see happening in the right meta, but right now I don't think it's a good choice. Another card, Soothsayer. It's not for this deck. We aren't playing any really valuable landmarks, and generally our spell sheet actually comes from the Warlord's Horde. It's not that good in this deck. I wouldn't play any copies of this. Preservarium, you could absolutely go up to 3 copies. If you do, I would recommend cutting an Ancient Preparations. This will give you a bit more of a stronger matchup into the mid-range and the control matchups. However, it does sacrifice a little bit in the aggro matchups. Blue Sentinel, I really love blue. This is a great card. However, I found that trying to fit him in didn't really work with the way the deck list is currently. Currently, we don't really want more than the 6/2 drops. Although he is a very good one, especially against aggro decks, because generally that 3 toughness means you can block twice into them. Currently, Akshan and Rockhopper are just more valuable. If you cut the Akshan and go up to 3 copies of both Taliyah and Malphite, put blue in, swap them out, absolutely, that would work and it should be fine. But right now, it doesn't feel amazing. Another issue with blue is I am kind of looking at him a little bit as if he's a landmark here, but the landmark is a little bit unreliable, it's a little bit unpredictable, and we don't have any amazing ramp targets. We have a couple, obviously Taliyah's nice to come out of turn early, Malphite is nice to come out of turn early, but it's not like we're playing your traditional kind of Targon decks where we've got an Aurelion Sol at the top of the curve to be able to just chuck out there. Another card you could absolutely play is Star Shaping. The main reason we're not at the minute is that essentially quite often it just clunked up my hands and I ended up with too many high cost cards in my hands when I was playing this. I was originally on 2 copies, that went down to 1, then it went down to 0, just as I kind of rebalanced and moved things more towards the early game. It can be very good in the right matchups. If you're against a more aggressive mid-range deck, it can feel really good because you heal up either something big such as a Malphite or potentially a Talia that's blocked already, or your Nexus if you've took a bunch of damage and you can get yourself a nice finisher. The Great Beyond is a particularly good one with the Elusive and the Spell Shield. However, one of the issues with it is that many of the more expensive Celestial cards get better the more Celestials you have cast, and we aren't really doing much else when we haven't got the Zoes in or your Solari Priestesses, and I think if you start to put them in, it's moving into a different deck. It could be good in the right matchups. I wouldn't ever play more than 2 copies of it currently, especially after the nerf, but potentially putting it in could be fine. Sunburst is a card that absolutely could fit in this deck. I think the main problem with it at the minute is the current meta. There's not many targets where it feels that good to cast it on. It is probably the only source of just single target hard removal that we have, that we don't have to invoke for, and I've kind of already said about why I don't particularly rate the invoke cards at the minute. But having this as an option feels really strong at times, but other times this just rots in your hand and it's a little bit too inconsistent, and I'd much rather just be pushing damage or playing to the board at any given time than relying on a Sunburst. Ruin Runner. You absolutely could play this card, and honestly, I don't think the deck would be any worse for it. However, it just would mean a little bit of reshuffling in the cards that you currently have in the deck. You could play up to 3 copies of this very easily. But if we kind of look at what we've got, you could cut a Stormbreaker, absolutely. Potentially you could cut the Earth Elementals, but they are a very strong card in this deck. So you would have to try and make space for it elsewhere, and that was kind of my reasoning, especially on the top end. You don't want too much top end right now. If when Bandle City comes out and you're wanting to play this deck, if the meta slows a bit, which I expect it will, absolutely put that card in there, run the 3 copies and just overwhelm people's faces, assuming it doesn't get nerfed. Let's kind of look at what we could cut and why you would cut it. So one card that is absolutely cuttable is the Ancient Hourglass. This is a piece of protection. We don't have a lot of that in this deck. However, it's not particularly strong. It's kind of situational. We do have some nice little combos we can do it with the Talia. However, they can feel a little bit gimmicky at times and they're not super reliable. Another card to cut, the Stormbreaker, I kind of covered why when I was talking about it. The problem with the Stormbreaker is if you've not activated him, he sucks. And even when you have activated him, he isn't amazing. Your opponent can probably play around him in some way, whether it's a combat trick, whether it's casting a Bastion, and he doesn't hit too many valuable targets right now. So I'm not the biggest fan of having a full playset for sure. You could absolutely cut them, and it's probably one of the first places I would start. Malphite, I think Malphite is a very reasonable cut right now. It depends how much mid-range that you're seeing. He does feel really good in the mid-range matchups, but there isn't too many mid-range decks that are traditional mid-range decks right now. So it's kind of up to you. You could absolutely cut them. You could bump them up to 2 copies depending on what your meta is right now. Vagabond, this card can very, very easily be cut. If you do, you don't even need to replace it with a 3-drop if you're trying to fit in the Ruin Runner. This could potentially be a place to you if you want to try and fit in some cheaper cost units. Again, this could be another good cut. However, if you are cutting it, I'll make sure to replace it with a unit because you will feel a little bit light on units without it. I would also definitely cut this card if you decide to cut the Akshan. Akshan is a good card and he is quite solid in this deck. We can use him kind of as a soft removal piece. However, I understand why some people wouldn't want to play him, especially if you're going into a tournament lineup or something like that and you want to fit in a Saver Akshan deck. I do think he brings a lot of value and I would really not recommend cutting him. However, if you do and you want to, make sure you replace him with another cheap unit, otherwise you'll find that you lose the board very early. So replacing him with a blue Sentinel or something like that would probably be my top pick. Push, some games this card is kind of dead, so I could understand why you want to cut it. Potentially, if you want something that's similar but different, Quicksand is a really good choice. Otherwise, you can kind of just cut and put whatever you fancy in. It is an essential, crucial part of the deck, but it is a nice tool that I personally really value having. Chip. No, sorry, you're not allowed. This is the whole point of running the deck. You run 3 chips or you don't play this deck. Okay, so something that I kind of want to touch on a little bit is the idea of playing Zilean in this deck, which it can work, but I'm not a fan of it. The reason you would play Zilean is that his time bombs are landmarks. This landmark, it is a good piece of AoE removal, which our deck really lacks in, and if you wanted to go down more of a controlling route, it can be quite a strong choice. The problem is that they are quite inconsistent, and Zilean on his own isn't a great card. If you leaned into putting in a little bit more draw and a little bit more predict, Zilean could potentially work, but right now I don't feel like I could recommend playing Zilean, especially over something like Akshan or the 1 copy of Malphite or whatever it might be. But it is an option and it can work. I just don't think this is the place for it.
Tell the people what you have seen today.